If you have said to yourself, I should write that, or if someone has said to you, you should write that, then I'm talking to you because you need to write. And that's why you're tuned in to yWrite. Hi, welcome to yWrite. I'm your host, Angela Grout, and I'm so glad that you've tuned in to another episode of yWrite, where I get to interview writers to find out why they're writing, how they're writing, and what they're writing, and you get to learn too. Have you ever read a book and then when it ended you said, wonder what happens next, and there wasn't a sequel? Well, my guest today is in studio, and he's doing exactly that. He is working on writing a book because the ending of a story, I guess, prompted him to want to know more. So we're going to talk to him about that. Now, when you see him, you are going to recognize him, at least the people in the local area here, but, probably maybe nationwide, too. He is a broadcast journalist and a news anchor for local television, and he has been a writer and a reporter for few decades now.
Couple of years.
And so I want to introduce Chris Pisano, who's here in the studio. And Chris is also from my hometown of Agawam, Massachusetts. And welcome.
Angela, thanks for having me. I am so impressed with this setup.
Oh,
honestly.
thank you.
I've never been on a podcast.
Oh.
So be gentle.
Okay.
This is new to me.
Oh, I like this. I like
thank you.
this. So yes, our podcast is both, transmitted visually, and also, people can just listen to it.
And that's how I always thought of a podcast.
Yes,
you
a lot
would
of
listen
people think
to
it's
it
audio.
in your car.
Yes.
But the fact that you have some video as well is helpful. I'm in my own element.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Let's see if it works.
So you can be comfortable
Right.
with the cameras and look at everybody. So, I'm going to tell the audience a little bit about, how I got to know about your writing. We all know that you're a reporter, and that could be a whole nother show because, of course, writing as a reporter is fascinating.
It's constant.
And I would love to know more about that. But today, I'm fascinated because I think it was like maybe 2 years ago, maybe a year ago, we talked through email about how you had an idea for a book.
Right.
You had reached out and said, I have an idea for a book, and we just chatted briefly. And then a couple of weeks ago, or early this year, you started voicing it on Facebook.
Right.
Your Facebook friends. And you were like, I'm working on a story. Is anyone interested? And I was like,
testing the water.
Yeah.
Testing the water.
I was like, he started it. This is exciting. And then I reached out to you and found out how far along you are in it. And of course, you were able to share some of it. So your story is called Hometown Spirit.
Hometown Spirit, The Legend of Captain Shanks was the working title.
Yeah.
I kind of shortened it to just Hometown Spirit. But you're right. I actually started the book, I'd say more than a decade ago.
Oh, yeah.
So it wasn't, they say it takes a lifetime to become an overnight success. It takes almost a decade or more, as far as I'm concerned, to write an overnight book.
100%. I worked on April Rain for probably 20 years.
Exactly.
I mean,
unless you're a full-time author, and few of us are, or have the luxury of having a lot of free time, and few of us do, you write it when you can.
Right.
And that's part of why I decided to write a book, because I wasn't sure if I could. I had a story to tell, and it was, I'm not going to get into exactly what the book is about, but having been in broadcasting at that time for about 20 years, I had immediately moved from Western Mass.
Yeah.
So at 18, I left the house. I went to UMass Amherst. Long story short, after graduate school, which was in Boston, I moved to Macon, Georgia. So at about 18, 19...
Working in broadcasting.
Broadcasting. I had left Western Mass and Agawam and all that I knew and all that was familiar and my friends and family. And it was my own doing. I had a wanderlust. I was a young man. I wanted to get out there and conquer the world.
Yeah,
and my biggest fear, was being 80, 90 years old and sitting on my front porch in a rocking chair and saying, what if? What if I hadn't done it? So I decided I'm going to do it. And in the business, in broadcasting, it's kind of like playing baseball or a sport. You start off in the minor leagues. You start off in a small city, a small market, and then as you build your career, you work your way up to the Red Sox or the Yankees. You go to Boston or New York or Chicago. But that entails a lot of moving. in order to get anywhere in this business, you have to be willing to move, or else you're not going to last.
Well, it's
very
nice
long.
that you were able to move back home.
It was.
I mean,
after many years.
How many people get to do that?
Well, that's it. I consider myself lucky, but I had always felt like a fish out of water, like the new kid in town. And that's where the impetus for Hometown Spirit came in. It's about a boy of maybe 12 or 13 who's from the big city and finds himself having to move with his family and leave everything he knows behind to a new city, or I should say a new town, a very small town.
Yeah.
And I set it in a fictitious town called Old Fenwick, which is on the coast of maybe Massachusetts or Maine or somewhere.
How'd you come up with the name of that town?
Well, being from New England, we have all these strange names.
Yeah.
Mystic and Old Saybrook and Wellfleet and Provincetown. And so I wanted it to have kind of a wild feel. You know, a fen is a swamp. So I said Fenwick. That kind of has a ring to it. And then I said, well, it's New England and everything's old.
This is how writers think, because we have to have an association. You know what I mean? Like even picking out character names for a
Exactly.
book, it's like picking up, you know, your child's name. Like what does it
Yes.
mean to you? What is the spiritual meaning of it? You know, like what how can this town be connected? You know?
Yeah, and it helped me visualize it as well. So I decided, well, it's Old Fenwick.
Okay.
And from there, I just began to think of, you know, my own experiences as a child going to the Cape each summer or going to the coast of Connecticut and just hanging out on the beach with friends. And then back here in Western Mass, spending so much time in Robinson Park as a kid and all the outdoor adventures that I used to have.
So I was going to ask you, like, what the difference is between, like, you know, journalistic writing, broadcast writing, and writing a fictional tale. But I'm almost hearing, like, I feel like, and you tell me if I'm wrong, like, for journalism, you have to do research.
Yes.
Whereas this book, you didn't have to do the research because you had the experience.
I didn't have to do the research putting the outline of the story together.
Okay.
I kind of had an idea of the characters I wanted to use and the situations I wanted to put them in. There's kind of there's a paranormal twist to it and a little bit of dark magic, you know, magical realism. But there's also mystery.
You did a full outline first?
I didn't. I did a chapter. And
you
it
had
was less
chapter
of an
titles?
outline, but one or two sentences.
Okay, yep, no, that's
Here's
an
what's
outline.
going to happen. And I knew what the
great
ending
plan.
was going to be
That's
already.
always important.
It came to me, and I knew what the beginning was going to be.
Yeah.
So I had the 2 slices of bread. I just had to fill in the sandwich in between.
Yeah.
And so I would always approach it the only way I can get things done is to compartmentalize.
I can't even
My
say
wife
that word,
swears
but I
I
say
have
that all the time.
ADD because I can't ever focus. So I would take it in very small steps.
Okay.
In this chapter, here's where I want to go. Here's how I want it to end. And then I would just write, you know, page by page.
Did you
to
write
get
it chronologically? Like it chronologically in a way of your outline? Like
I did.
You did, okay.
I did. You know, it was my first book. I guess you could say it's kind of a trite style of writing where you literally write it in chronological order to the book.
I mean, I've done that with my outlines, but I've also done some where I've said, you know what, I don't want to write this chapter today. I'm going to write this chapter.
Ah, okay.
But I will say, jumping ahead to write it, you definitely end up rewriting it. I mean, you do rewrites anyways, but because you have to make them, you know, flow. But I was like, I know what this is going to be, so it's like just let it flow. And you know, so and you had said on Facebook when you were doing, you know, sort of your pre-marketing. I mean, that's wonderful.
Well, we can get to that in a minute. Yeah.
But you had said like there was a day that the pen just flowed.
Yeah,
What was that day like?
I had been I was working in the business, and you know, I was also busy with my personal life, and life has a way of just taking you down paths you don't necessarily choose. You know, the quickest way to make God laugh is to tell him your plans. That's one of my favorite sayings.
100%.
And I decided one day, after thinking about it, I'm like, well, just do it. And it was more of a dare to myself. I compared it to running a marathon. I did the same thing with a marathon. I was running maybe a half an hour a day, and I thought I always wanted to run a marathon. So, not knowing any better, I'm like, well, then do it. And
writing a book is a marathon.
It is. I would say almost even harder, certainly intellectually harder. So I just put pen to paper one day and I thought, let's just see where this goes. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And as I said, I had this story that had been percolating in my mind, and I didn't just want it to be semi-autobiographical story because it's not.
Right.
I wanted it to have some elements for the reader to figure out. We're going on a journey together. It was the book that I always wanted to read as a young adult or a kid. And I say that because I had at the time been reading a lot of Stephen King, which isn't necessarily for children, but Dan Brown's books, the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
Those
I've taken a class with him online.
books that are thrillers and full of action, and also have these puzzles that you need to work out that are in plain sight, but you have that aha moment. I see how this works and how all the pieces fit together and how the protagonists are going to figure this mystery out, or will they?
Yeah.
So I came up with this kind of idea for a mystery where this young boy, again, he moves to this new town. He has this big old house that the family moves in, and he hears these phantom footsteps. And he becomes good friends with this other kid, Cassius, whose father's also the mayor. Typical small town. He owns a hardware store. He's also the mayor and has multiple jobs. And the boy tells him that there's a legend that his house used to belong to this infamous bloodthirsty pirate, Captain Shanks. And after a few months, he decides, well, if this ghost is going to keep bothering me, I'm going to get to the bottom of who he was and see if I can contact him and tell him to knock it off.
Yeah.
And that leads to the real crux of the story, in that the appearance of the town, this quaint little New England town, everything on the surface is going well, but underneath it has some really dark history.
One of the chapters that you shared with me that I read, I think it's the boy sitting on the bench with this old man.
Right.
And the old man says, things are not always as they appear.
And that's a running theme through the book.
As
soon as you
it's
think
a running
you figure
theme
it out,
in my own life.
Right.
I mean, in all of our lives, really, because you think you see one thing,
and you don't.
Like when you're saying this town seems like your typical town.
Yeah, it's a sleight of hand. I'm a big fan of cliffhangers. Love cliffhangers. Because it not only just is, it's satisfying for me at the end of the chapter that there's this big setup, and then, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now?
Yeah.
How are they going to get out of this? I want to keep reading.
Yeah.
And even as a writer, that kept me engaged to then write a situation that ends in a cliffhanger, and then, all right, now how am I going to get my protagonist out of this?
So was there one particular book that you had read that you said, I wonder what happens, or is it books in general that left you with a cliffhanger?
Books in general.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, some of the big books from my youth, obviously The Hobbit, with Tolkien. But also, even as an adult, as I mentioned, Dan Brown, big. Michael Crichton, the greats.
Yeah.
And I know it's cliche and trite.
No, I know.
But those were the books that I read, and I definitely found that there was a style of writing. I love, and I keep going back to Stephen King, I don't always enjoy the book, but he has such an easy flow of writing. We were talking earlier about when you write, you can't always assume the viewer, there's my TV talking, the reader is going to understand your inflection.
Right.
With Stephen King, he puts those words down, and
yeah.
Again, you might not like the book, but his style of writing is perfect.
I sent him an email years ago. And I said, I want to know why you're writing what you're writing, because it's
prolific.
Ooh, I'm like, I don't even want to read what you're writing. You know what I mean? That's how I felt. And then, he did write me back, but it's probably his people say. And ironically, a few days before I got the response, I happened to go into Barnes and Noble, and I'm looking at the Stephen King books, and I discovered his book On Writing.
Yes, I read that.
And
yes.
I read it, and I was like, this is why he writes what he writes. Like, it answered my question.
Sure.
The universe gave me that answer. And then a few days later, I get the email, and he said, so many people have asked this, and you should read my book on writing. And I was like, yep, did that. But it was like, okay, now I understand, because I obviously I have a show called Why Write. I'm interested in why people write what they write. I mean, the how they wrote it is fascinating.
Masochism. I think that's why a lot of people write. For me, it was cathartic. It was therapy.
Well, and it's the whole dedication and the passion to sit down and do it. Like the day you said, I'm just going to pick up my pen and see what happens, And then as it unfolds, it's like, this is kind of the how you're doing it. And then, you're kind of at that stage now where how you're sharing what you did to move it to a mainstream audience if you're
And-
going to.
Well, I finished the book probably within a year or two. Fits and starts and this and that, and using whatever free time I had to write. And I just put it away,
Yeah. Sitting on the...
figuratively speaking, because
No.
it wasn't a hard copy.
I say
it
I
was
have
a
them on the
computer.
stove simmering.
Yeah. And I didn't let anybody read it. I didn't even tell many people I was writing it. It just sat on a thumb drive for years. And I just thought within the last year or so, it pops up every time from time to time, in casual conversation. Well, I wrote a book,
Yeah.
but really I didn't. It's not a book, it's a manuscript. I always think authors are writers that just don't give up. We're all writers, but becoming an author is a big step.
True.
So I think it was a combination of me just deciding the time is now right, no pun intended, to maybe resurrect it. But also social media has become such a large force. Before, the standard route to getting published was you would literally type up your book, you would send a query letter off, maybe even a hard copy query letter.
Right.
You'd mail it to a literary agent.
Which, what you've done earlier in the show, talking about it, is a great query letter right there.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I'm always thinking of my elevator pitch.
It's a good, simple, yeah.
Right. And then you'd wait a month or 2 or 6
3
months.
or 6 years.
And, you might not hear back, or you might thank you. At this time, it's just not quite the right fit.
Right.
Blah, 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 blah. But nowadays, even beyond self-publishing, you can become your own marketer.
You have to.
And get enough people interested that you bring something to the table to a potential publishing house.
Yes.
You bring your own brand that's already established.
And they do look for that,
They
because
do.
I've been to pitching sessions.
Well, it makes
I've
their
been to
job
workshops.
easier.
They want to make sure you have an audience. People.
Right.
Whether a lot of writers think, oh, there's an audience for a murder mystery. Do you know what I mean? Because no. Do you as an author have an audience?
Have an audience, exactly.
Because it's one thing to sell the book and what it's about, but it's another thing to and you're not selling Chris Pisano, but you sell Chris Pisano to your friends and your family and your audiences, who then become marketers for you.
Exactly. Word of mouth.
Yes.
And ultimately that's what it comes down to. And social media, just amplifies that quote word of mouth, because it's now, instead of just your close circle, it's thousands or tens of thousands of people you might not even have met before, or otherwise wouldn't have met through social media. And another part of it was not just simply to, I guess, get my book out there, but I wanted to know if what I wrote
Was interesting.
I don't want to say good.
Yeah, if people were interested in it. Yeah. No, and
And
you
you
put
look at
like a
it-
nice, this is what it's about. If you're interested in it, I'll send you the first chapter or something. So you weren't saying, here's my first chapter, and posting this big long text, which some people have done.
Yeah, info dump.
Yes,
Boom.
info dump. It's like, okay, if you're interested, reach out, and then there you go. You can find that information. But being your own marketer for it is very important.
Oh, absolutely.
And for me, and I mean, you're a public figure, so you are used to fans and followers.
Yeah.
But putting it out there exposes you too, and what you've done. My book Dear Baby Get Out was about the final days of pregnancy.
Yeah.
But I always use this with my writers groups to say, if you have a story in you, you're the only one who can get that baby out. It is so similar to pregnancy, because of course you incubate it. Then you start showing yourself, on the paper what it is going to be. But then there comes a point where you have to tell people. And then you put it into the world, and it's scary.
It is.
It's scary. So, actually saying, I'm writing a book, or I'm about to, publish a book, and you've put those words out there, kind of solidifies what you're doing, because you're like, okay, I said it, so now I guess I got to prove it.
Well, and using your baby analogy, I compare the manuscript is almost like a child.
Yes.
You look through your child through the eyes that no one else does.
Yes.
You cannot be subjective.
No.
I mean, objective about your
That's why I
child.
don't like editing my
Right.
books.
And so you think what you wrote is compelling.
Yeah.
I mean, this is good stuff. But it's like telling people you have a good kid.
Yeah.
Of course you think your child is wonderful.
Yeah.
You need
My
outside
child is more
eyes.
talented than yours.
Exactly.
My child walked at 7 months old. How about you? You know, it's like turns
But
into a little
it's
competition.
meaningless because obviously you love your child. You
Right.
think they hung the moon. So for me to tell people I have a great book you need to read doesn't mean anything. And I just wanted to. I was at one of my son's wrestling meets, and I don't know what came over me. I just thought, you know what? I'm going to post the prologue to my book and see if anybody. And I had been kicking it around for a while. I'm on social media, but I'm certainly not an expert. And I wasn't even sure if that was the proper thing to do.
Yeah.
Generally, my posts are short and sweet with a picture, maybe a little funny, turn to it. But now I'm
But it
posting
shows who you are.
pages of
Yeah.
copy. That was a big change for me. And so I first said, is anybody even interested? I wrote a book years ago. I'll post a page or two. Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I posted it. And I guess it gave me the courage or the impetus to then continue. And through those posts, and as more and more people reacted and shared it, I was contacted by a gentleman who runs a publishing house and said, hey, I'm interested. Tell me a little bit more about your book. We got to talking, and the problem is I found I wrote the book for myself.
Well, we have to do that.
And I didn't write it to be a commercial success.
Yeah.
But I don't mean I didn't write it that it's not compelling. I wrote it until it was done. And it's a hunky book. I mean, it's 40,000 pages.
Wait,
so
140,000?
yes.
140,000 words.
Words, not pages. I'm sorry.
I'm like,
No.
wow, you have
Each
got a
page
record.
has
Yes.
one word.
See,
It's about this thick.
I understand.
Right. But you're right.
I'm
Words.
like words, pages. Yes.
That
so,
would be insane.
Yeah. So I mean, it's in between these two here.
Yeah, and I find that now with the market, more and more publishers want something that's a little shorter and snappy.
Yes.
They want the literary equivalent to a Big Mac, something that's
a
easy
lot
to
of people
consume.
like to binge read. So like if it's under, I think they say like 170 pages or so, somebody could binge read that in one sitting.
I don't read that way.
See, I can read that way.
I love if the book is good, I don't want it to end. And I think that my story, and he said, listen, if you can cut it down, maybe even consider 2 books.
Oh.
We'll talk.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm at now.
Nice.
Is I found after going through it, because I was always re-editing it and rewriting it and
I had a
tightening
guest
it
on the
up.
show a couple weeks ago. I think it's Randy Goodwin that he did that. He had a book and he split it into 2.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think they're still both like 300 pages.
Well, this cut it down into more palatable sizes.
Yeah.
I think the first book would be roughly 70,000 words, and then the second one would be like maybe 60,000. And if you're not a writer, you don't understand. But that's more of an approachable book.
Yeah, we talk about word count is important.
It is important. So that's where I'm at now. I'm just looking to, again, I need some type of objective set of eyes, an editor, to just look through the first book.
I have a couple names for you that I can pass along. So,
and
especially someone who goes in that genre.
Here's where you need to maybe shave it. Here's where you should polish it. Here's a part that I think you could maybe turn it a little better. Whatever. Right. Again, you get so close to your work, I don't think you can be an objective editor.
No. Because
it's too painful.
No, and I found when I was in the editing process for April Rain, of course I thought it was a good polished edition. And, we're going through chapter by chapter, and, my editor would say to me, okay, so you introduced this character here, and you started you're having a random conversation with Chris Pisano.
Right.
Who is he? How did he just show up in chapter 4?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, it's like you got to introduce him a little earlier. And it was so easy to do because earlier I'd be like, oh, next week I'm going to meet Chris Pisano. Do you know what I mean? Like just a little thing like that.
You knew what you meant, so reading it, you already had that in your brain.
Yeah.
But somebody coming in cold doesn't know anything about the story.
Right.
And if it doesn't flow to them, that's a problem.
You got to have the flow of the story, and your book Hometown Spirit is similar in a way to how I had to do April Rain, because you go a little bit back and forth with timelines.
Yes.
So
I like to play with timelines.
So when you're playing with timelines, you also, as like an editor's eye, has to handle the tense of the words.
Right.
Because are you are you talking about the past, but you're in the present moment talking about it?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you in the present moment talking about the past? So it's tricky. And that's something that as a writer, we write it thinking we know where we are.
Right.
But the reader's like,
no,
needs
they
the clarity.
don't. And
So
to circle
editing is
back,
process.
to tie things back up, what you're saying is exactly why I wanted to write a book. Not just to tell the story, but to see if I could do it. Writing, everybody can write, but to write something of that magnitude, 100, 150 page, 200 pages, and to make it make sense, like you say, with verb tenses, with timeline shifts, with multiple characters, with storylines and an arc and an end and protagonist and the antagonist, you've got a lot of balls in the air that you're juggling. And it's not as easy, if it even does sound easy.
Yeah. Well, my second book, it was a challenge to me. So I wonder if I could do it again.
Because that's just it. Now going in.
Could I do it again?
Exactly.
I do it again? And then, doing April Rain and the current book that I'm on, it's really like, now it's like it gets harder each time. I want to say it gets easier, but it gets harder. Because, for me anyways, I have more characters coming into play, and when you have more characters, especially when it's fictional, you have to come up with their names, and you know how many times I've changed names that I have to have my own little flow chart, and I'm like, who's that again?
Right.
And I'm editing my 5th book now, and in it, just last night I'm like, oh my gosh, I left her name as Hannah here. It's not Hannah anymore.
Yes.
And I had thought I had done the find replace, but it didn't get that one, I guess.
And beyond just coming up with the story, make it compelling. I find that new writers especially are so prone to purple prose. You info dump everything. Yes. Everything is exquisitely described.
Oh, the details.
And and that was the problem with my first draft.
Yeah.
And I went through and I found that saying less actually is more.
Yes.
Leave it up to the reader to fill in those blank spots, because their imagination is much stronger than any word you could put on the page.
100%.
So I find the blank spaces are almost more important to the story than actually writing a block of words.
Yep.
Because then you're limiting it.
Yeah.
Keep some things, make some implications, keep things flowing and concise.
Yeah.
But leave room so that they can fill in the story, as long as they know where the story's going. And I think that makes not only for better reading, but also much better writing.
Yeah, a lot of the characters in my book, April Rain, I didn't describe a lot. Like, I might say the police officer, things like that. The woman, the bartender. And I've now made it into a movie script, so maybe you want to star in it. That would be really good. You could be the news reporter.
I don't know about. Funny, because I've been pigeonholed. I played movie. Reporting positions or TV reporters now in 3 movies.
Oh.
So I'm getting typecast at this point.
Okay, yeah. Well, after the show, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that's coming up in a few weeks that maybe you can take part in, because I do some theater too. I will provide food. I will even cook if you want me to. But it's like doing that. It's like, you like I was saying, you have all the confusion of all your characters and trying to have their backstories.
Right.
And when you're doing that first draft, you get very detailed with the backstories, with their descriptions.
Too detailed.
And like you said, you don't have to have all that description. So like when I'm writing this, when I wrote the movie script and now I'm doing the character, descriptions, I'm just like, 56-year-old guy for the police chief. And, I'm like, do I need to put he's bald, or do I need to, that? None of that matters.
If it doesn't forward the story,
if
it doesn't have any reader benefit, toss it.
Right.
You don't need to world build.
No.
It has a purpose in a sense, but don't go overboard.
Yeah. And with your book, Hometown Spirit, people who are reading it are going to put themselves in, possibly in the position of the little boy.
Ideally.
Yeah. So they're going to relate to even the surroundings as you've described them, to the surroundings that they are familiar with.
Yes.
So
I find if you overwrite, you're going to have a very prosaic book, in that it's just very cut and dry. Again, keep the flow going. Less is always more. Says the guy who wrote 140,000 word manuscript.
Words.
But trust me, that's even cut down from the original. We're
So,
running out of
we're-
time.
we're
Angela.
fine with time. We're fine
I keep
with time.
looking at
I
the
know.
clock. I live by the clock
I
in
know,
broadcasting.
and I sometimes at the beginning of the show, before we began, I said, well, if we go a little over, it's okay. And as soon as I say that, it goes over a little bit.
Isn't that the truth?
All right, so we've talked a lot about today about, your process of writing the
process.
book and of marketing yourself and, putting yourself out there. You have the book, it's done. I know it needs some editing.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, a book is never done.
No,
you know that. You can
no.
always keep editing, but at some point you
have
have to
to.
wash your hands and say,
Yep.
Jesus,
100%.
take the wheel,
Yep.
right?
I did it as a florist. I used to do that. Like, okay, I'm making this flower arrangement. You can always fix,
Yes.
add. And it's like, nope, done, go, take
Exactly.
it. It's done. Because you can spend all day and then, also put more money into it that
And
you
you
don't
almost
need to.
risk fouling the stew.
Yeah.
You've got to know when to walk away from
So
it.
it's
And
good
I'm
that-
at
so
that
you're at
point.
that point.
I'm at that point.
So what do you think what's your next step and when do you think this book will be?
I don't have a
Deadline?
A deadline. I haven't put in an idea that it's got to be out by May or it's got to be out because it's been kicking around for the better part of a decade. When it happens, it happens. I hope that it would be within this year.
Okay.
And trust me, everyone will be the first to know. Well, how about you're the first to know?
Okay.
But I'll post it on social media. A lot of people expressed
when you're doing
interest.
your own work like this, you can give yourself a deadline, but you can move it. Whereas if you're working in broadcasting, you have a deadline, you can't miss
And that may be
deadline.
part of I think for myself, there was a relief in writing something that I have total control over because you're right, in broadcasting, deadlines are measured in seconds.
Yes.
I have to be on the anchor desk at 4 p.m. The story has to end in a minute and 30 seconds. Right. With a book, it doesn't have to be published. I would like to have it published.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, it doesn't.
Oh, it will.
If it does, it does. So I'll keep. Now the issue is, it ended in such a way, again, the old cliffhanger, that
you can
leaves
write
itself
another
up
one.
to, okay, so what's going to happen now? He's figured out who Captain Shanks is and everything else that's been going on. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that he could go after. And the prologue of the first book is me thinking, what happened 50, 60 years after this whole event?
That's my whole motto in things is, what if and what happened.
And playing with the timeline. So
with
you
it.
start off way in the future, and then this old man says, would you like to hear a story?
Yeah.
And here's the story.
Love it.
But it hasn't ended yet. It may never end.
Well, it's like our story in life. It just continues and continues.
I think for me it would be, again, it's that I set the goal, write a book, write a manuscript.
Yeah.
And then now I've set a goal, get
To
it
publish
published.
a book.
Try and get it published.
Become an author.
Yes.
Yes.
From a writer to an author.
Yes.
And I don't know that I'm willing to give up easily. So to your point, yes, I'd like to think it will be
It's
a book one day. I just don't know that
you
day.
you have a passion inside you, and when God gives you a mission, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. You know, and the perfect timing is when it's going to happen.
When it happened, but it seems like it's accelerated. And and again, I don't want to take too much time. I do think a large part of it is because the whole dynamic of the publishing world has
Totally changed,
so momentously just within the last decade.
Yeah, I mean,
Through
so many
social
people do
media.
self-publishing, and they promote their books just through that market, and it can be very successful. But to get to the mainstream audience, and when I say mainstream, I mean like worldwide audience, you need a publisher.
A publisher, exactly.
You can. I mean, I can have this show, and I can talk about my books, and I can do social media and network locally, and get readers, but I don't know, I can't take it to that next level.
You can't.
So if someone's looking for that next level, that's what they need to do.
That's the hard part.
And, right now you already know you have this nice local community who's supporting you and interested in reading about the hometown spirit because you're from our hometown, we almost feel like this hometown is our spirit too.
Well, yeah, there are some elements that I based on Agawam, and back to that, the publisher that reached out to me said, I see you have a built-in audience, which I think was his impetus to reach out and
Yep.
say,
Well,
hey, why
100%.
don't we see if we can work together?
Yeah.
And I was like, all right. If you're foolish enough to try to work with me, who am I to say no?
Well, the book also, the muse of your book and the book will carry it where it needs to go.
I just want to be able to look at a bookshelf one day with this old moldering, dusty volume and say, that's the book that I wrote.
Have you been to Barnes & Noble or the library where you look to see where your book would go?
No, I
go
haven't.
do that. It's fun.
No, I don't even plan that.
No,
far.
I've walked around and I'm like, especially when I'm struggling, like, what genre is this? Like, where? I mean, I know it's not going in the computer science area. I know,
and that's just it. And again,
figuring
we're
out
going
the
to go
genre.
off on another tangent here.
The
but
genre it is.
when you're asked, well, what is the is it young adult? Is it middle grade? Is it thriller? Is it paranormal? Is it normal fantasy? Is it new adult? Is it horror? Is it paranormal? Like, yes.
It sounds like young adult and adult to me.
It only because
the paranormal.
one of the rules is you go on the age of your protagonist.
Right.
That's generally.
Yeah.
And I've never been one to go generally by the rules. But yes, I think if I had to pigeonhole it, I would say probably young adult, which right then and there is not necessarily a turn on or turn off to some people. It's like baking a cake. Some people like chocolate cake, some people like vanilla cake.
Yeah, but just because it says, young adult, you also have the story about it too, so you can still be in the fictional market. You can add a little of the paranormal.
Yes.
And, with the way they market things, you have so many kind of subgenres that, you can tap into.
Exactly.
Which helps, so.
And I tell people it reads up. You're not going to be reading, Dick and Jane. See Dick run, see Jane, a child of probably early teens could read it. I don't mean it's so esoteric that you don't understand what's going on or it's, so high English.
Yeah.
But the themes
are a little
up.
A little more mature.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh. Well, I'm excited for you. I'm excited to see where this is going.
It's me saying a lot about nothing.
I'm gonna print like the email from years ago and this email, and just follow the process of it.
You're very kind.
So.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming.
I'm wrapping already for you.
Yes, wrap it up. Wrap it up. Because this show could be probably a 2-hour segment because I would love to talk to you about broadcast journalism and all of that too.
Anytime.
But talking about inspiring people to write the book that they have in their head and sitting down and doing it and just doing the what if. What would have happened if this happened? So.
When we first came in here, there's a gym that's maybe 50 yards away.
Yeah.
And I mentioned jokingly, the hardest piece of equipment in a gym is the front door. And I think that's an analogy also for writing. Mm-hmm. The hardest part of writing is just sitting down,
getting in the chair
and writing it. Getting in the chair.
Yeah, you can talk about it all day,
and that's it. You'll talk yourself blue in the face.
It's a lonely sport.
Yeah,
because you can't do it with other. You have to sit down and just.
It's an experience, and again, the marathon. It is. You're not in it for the sprint. You're in it for the marathon. You just keep plugging.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to have a story that I was so interested in that it almost. It flowed. You said sometimes you write so quickly.
Oh yeah,
and it was the same for me. It was just a torrent of ideas and I was new to it, so I didn't have a style. I was just putting word to paper.
Yeah. Well, I did this book in 9.5 hours.
Oh my gosh!
I binge wrote it in 9.5 hours.
You got me beat.
But
that also lends itself to heavy editing.
But heavy
Exactly.
editing. Yes, this one I did pretty much in like a week. This one, I like I said, it probably took 20 years, but there was a lot of research to do, was a lot of characters, but I did try to treat it like a marathon, like you were saying, and I actually looked at a calendar and I was like, okay,
pace yourself.
I want to do this many words each day, because I know the book needs to be, this many chapters. I have my outline, so I'm going to say, okay, the average chapter is going to have, say 2,000 words or whatever, and then, marketing it out like that. And, it was good to see, of course, like I said, being yourself, self-boss when you're writing. You can say, oh, I'm not doing today, skip that.
Yeah, some days you're just not in it, some days you are.
And then I'm visual, so, and I don't know if I've ever shared this on here, but every chapter I finished after I was, like, kind of polishing it before it went to an editor, I would get a rock somewhere, and I started building a rock wall in my backyard.
No kidding.
Because I'd look out.
How big's the wall?
It's long. It's it's got 43 rocks.
Yes.
So I literally would just put a rock down so I could start seeing. After I had like 12 chapters done, I was like, I need to see my progress.
Yeah.
So I'm looking out my window, when I'm writing, and I just started lining up rocks, and I was like, okay. So every time I drive by like those nice rock walls, I think, I wonder if someone else did that, and that's a lot that they wrote.
That's what I meant.
But you know,
That's
it was
a lot
just
of
like the
writing.
visual of saying, wow, I did that many, and you know, I still have that way to go. But you know, then when the yard's almost
you
getting
can visualize
complete, it was
how
I don't
far
know,
you
the
are
crazy
in your wall
thinking we do
completion.
just to try to get through
And
it.
you know, to your point as well, there is no right or wrong way. What's the secret of writing? Writing.
Yeah.
People that, well, how'd you write a book? Why would you?
Yeah.
I don't know. Some things you just.
Well, and
I
this
can't
is
put
one
to
of the main
words.
reasons I started this show is because people will say to me, you know, how do you do this? How do you do this? And I think if I get writers of all kinds, like, you know, book writers, television writers, script writers, stage writers, you know, podcast writers on the show and talk about how they did it, one of those ways might hit for someone watching.
Exactly.
And they're going to say, oh, Chris Pisano just sat down and picked up a pen one day? Okay, I could try that. Or this person tried it this way. I mean, there's so many different ways to get into the seat to write that if you can be motivated and inspired by another writer in some way, I mean, watch the show because, you know, I think there's, I don't know, almost 80 episodes right now. So
Right.
there's 80 people to draw information from.
And getting inspired from other authors, again, going back to all the books and authors that I've followed and read. I think I mentioned, was it in your email or maybe it was on a Facebook post? I just said I started writing this as well because after reading so many books, I thought, as a true neophyte and someone who didn't know any better, I probably could have written that a little better. Which, talk about hubris. You know, looking back at it, I think here's a guy that's never written a word as far as literary, I mean, news aside, who now thinks I could one-up,
Hey,
pick
you know.
your author.
Well,
And that's what I brought into the book. I'm like, well, here's what I really would like to see happen in a book.
Right.
And here's I always felt that some action scenes never really played out
yeah.
as well as I think it could, or the idea of the suspense building and the
high speed.
horror,
Yeah.
and so I thought I could probably do that a little better. But that's the caveat is I realize that that's me talking
But you
to
can do
me.
it your way.
Right.
And your way can be
For me is better.
Is better.
But it may not
100%.
be for anyone else.
But there's a lot of different people out there who like a lot of different things,
Right.
you know. And yeah, I mean, I've been, you know, see plays and read books and, you know, watched television shows, and I'm like, I probably could have wrote this episode.
Yeah, I think we've all been there.
You know, you all get to that point, and
Yeah.
you know, I mean, and I'm the type of person when I'm reading a book, I write in it because I'll sometimes have a conversation with the character or with the author.
Oh, wow.
So I always have to be like, I have to own this book because I have to write in it here. But you know, it's like just doing that, like, you know, I will have more of a conversation with it than being an editor to it.
Yes.
But there are times where I'll find something that I was like, oh well, that could have been written this way. But I'm like, but that's the way they did it. That's their style. So I'm not gonna, you know, say it's not good. It's
Well, at the end of the day, they wrote the book.
100%.
They had the idea.
Yeah.
They put
Yeah.
in the time, the blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah.
So you can't take anything
And that's
away
the thing is,
from
if you have
anyone
that
writes a
idea,
book.
you can say to someone else, "Do you want to write?" I mean, you can hire a ghostwriter. I mean, you could have hired a ghostwriter for sure.
But then that wasn't the whole idea.
you
Was
wanted to,
was
yeah.
the challenge
Yes.
to do it, and I did it. So now, I'm resting on my laurels.
All right. Well, we're gonna rest with you for today, but in the future, when you're watching this episode, this book could be on Amazon, so you're gonna have to check it out.
This
It's
is
called
wood, right?
Hometown Spirit. So I want to thank Chris Pisano for
Angela,
coming in.
thank you. It was a pleasure.
This was a lot of fun.
I appreciate
A lot of
that.
fun. I want to have
Anytime
more
I can
conversations.
sit down and talk is a good day.
And you didn't have to bring anything prepared. You didn't have to go
Just me,
just you and what's in here.
which is scary.
Well, again, thank you for coming in, and I want to thank you, the audience, for tuning into this episode of yWrite and for subscribing to the yWrite channel on Spotify and on YouTube, and to just continually showing up every time I do have a new guest, because it keeps me in this chair and it keeps my curiosity fed also. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of yWrite. And for those of you who may have be just joining us today, at this time of the program, I provide a writing prompt for you. So the deal is, when the show ends, I want you to pick up a pen, set your timer, whether it's on your telephone or your microwave or on your watch or whatever. Set it just for 8 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes if you have it. But, 8 minutes, you're going to see you're going to get a lot done. And I'm going to give you a writing prompt today, which is, kind of off of what Chris and I have been talking about. When you have that story inside of you that you're saying, like, what if, or what would have happened. And maybe you've read a book at some point in your life that is your favorite book, and you've been attracted to those characters, and they're your friends. Like, what happened now that the book is done? What happened to them? What could they be doing? What if they were your neighbor right now? Or what happened after the book ended? Why don't we sit down and just write down what that book was, who the characters are, and then just create a story about what they're doing right now. All right, enjoy that writing prompt. And again, thank you for tuning in to yWrite. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.